In my videos, I often or almost exclusively talk about the late Roman Empire, because that is the era of the Roman Empire that interests me the most. But what exactly do we mean when we say late Roman Empire? When exactly was the late Roman Empire? From when to when? After all, the Roman Empire fell as late as 1453, the last remnant states even a few decades later. So then, are the mid to late Middle Ages the late Roman Empire? Or do we mean the late Western Roman Empire? Is there even an exact definition on what the late Roman Empire even means? Historical definitions are, as you can guess, not always extremely precise. When can we still talk about an empire? Was the late Western Roman Empire really even an empire anymore? And what about the Byzantine Empire, as historians like to call the later Eastern Roman Empire? Does that even count as a Roman Empire? You see that there arise problems when defining a late Roman Empire. That empire should by definition still be somewhat recognizable as Roman, and it should still be an empire. The beginning of the late Roman Empire is normally defined to start at some point after the crisis of the 3rd century. This period of great chaos and instability in the Roman Empire, where the Roman Empire nearly fell, makes a lot of sense to take as the starting point for the term late Roman Empire. Most definitions take 284 AD as a starting point. It was in that year that the Emperor Diocletian issued his famous reforms in order to stabilize the Roman Empire. By that time, the 50 years of continuous barbarian invasions and civil wars had led to a quite profound cultural and military shift in the empire. It was during that time that the legions would start transforming from the famous legion and auxiliary system of the early empire to the comitatenses and limitanei system. The auxiliaries were troops that were not quite as well equipped as the legions and normally recruited from the provinces, often from allied tribes of the borders. However, in 211 AD, the Emperor Caracalla issued a law that would give all free men of the empire equal status. They would henceforth all have the Roman citizenship. Before that, it was only the Italian Romans who had this. Thus, the legions until this point had the Roman citizenship, whereas the auxiliaries did not. This was a huge change. Hence, the distinction between legions and auxiliaries did not make sense anymore. Thus, the comitatenses and limitanei system emerged. The comitatenses comprised the mobile field armies, well equipped and well trained, whereas the limitanei were recruited often from foederati border tribes, less well equipped and stationary in order to defend the vast borders of the empire. During this time, the equipment also began to change, from the legionary that is famous and depicted in basically every Hollywood movie about the Roman Empire, to the late Roman comitatenses and limitanei, who looked quite different. I talked in detail about the differences between the old legions and the new comitatenses in these two videos here. But not only did the soldiers wear different equipment after the crisis of the 3rd century, and the military organization was different, but cavalry was now much more important. Gallienus was the first to create a dedicated cavalry corps, and the role of cavalry was generally more pronounced than in the early empire, in order to be able to deal more effectively with barbarian invaders. Apart from the military, there was a huge cultural transformation that took place in that time. First of all, many cities were either abandoned or transformed due to the many civil wars or barbarian incursions. Paris, for instance, Lutetia Parisiorum as it was called back then, went from a prosperous city of maybe 20,000 inhabitants in the 2nd century to a half-abandoned town where many of its buildings lay in ruins and where only a heavily fortified inner core was still inhabited that was much better suited to defend against possible future invasions. That mostly affected the outer-lying cities in border provinces, not so much Italy itself. But during these times of utter calamities, Christianity began to gain more popularity, and this of course led to the first open building of churches, which understandably had an impact onto the cityscapes of the empire. Many new cults had gained popularity also, such as the cult of Sol Invictus or of Mithras. But then the figure of the emperor himself had now become more autocratic. Gone were the days of the Principate, where the emperor was officially first among equals of the Senate. Diocletian made this transformation final. The emperor was now Dominus et Deus, and thus the Principate finally gave way to the Dominate. The emperor had now even more authority, and the Senate was basically reduced to just a formal role, and from taking an active role in the governing of the entire state to only the surroundings of Rome. The emperor now often even appeared much more splendorous as before, dressed in expensive robes, and it was during this time also when the emperor began to wear a diadem with pearls and gems, instead of a more simplistic and modest type of laurel crown. But not only the clothing of the emperor changed, but also the clothing of regular civilians. A Roman from after the crisis of the 3rd century would be unrecognizable to a Roman from the late Republic or early Empire. So much had the foreign influence already taken hold of the Roman culture. I talked in detail about the clothing of the late Roman Empire in this video here. And if you are a Rome nerd like me, and chances are pretty high that you are if you are watching this video, then you might be interested in the incredible rings and other Roman accessories which the SPQR Shop is building. And now you can even order the one and only Maiorianus channel ring in order to honor the great Emperor Majorian, to whose memory I dedicated this channel. As you can see, it is wonderfully handcrafted, and you can see the incredible amount of detail and craftsmanship that the amazing people from SPQR Shop invested into this ring. And you can order one in bronze and even silver. I wonder what Majorian would say to that, could he see that his memory still shines brightly 1562 years after his death. This is a must for every true Majorian fan, and of course, as a nice side effect, it would greatly help this channel in order to spread the word about the heroes of the late Roman Empire. I put the link to their shop in the video description and into the pinned comment, and with this link you can get a 10% rebate on every purchase if you type in the rebate code Maiorianus. So go and check out their assortment, it's really quite incredible. So back to the late Roman Empire. We see that the definition of 284 AD for the start of the late Roman Empire makes sense. Also, it was in that time when we would see the empire first divided into several parts. Diocletian divided the empire into 4 parts, the famous Tetrarchy, and from that time onwards the empire would more often than not be divided into at least 2 parts, an eastern and a western half. A division with grave and disastrous consequences for the western half, and it was in that time that the foundation for this was laid. However, another definition for the start of the late Roman Empire is with the rise of Christianity. Other historians namely tend to mark the beginning of the late Roman Empire with Constantine's victory over Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD. This definition also makes sense, since after that fateful day, the victory of Christianity was almost a done deal and the death of paganism almost inevitable. This of course would lead to a profound cultural change. The Roman cityscapes would now slowly start to transform, where great Christian basilicas would now come to dominate the silhouette of the cities, and the old Greco-Roman temples would now be more and more frequently abandoned. Slowly at first, almost not noticeable, but only 100 years later, the temples were all closed and not used for religious purposes anymore, while more and more churches were constructed. So it does make sense to take the starting point of the late Roman Empire as late as 312 AD. We thus can say that the late Roman Empire started in the late 3rd or early 4th century AD, depending on your preference. But what about the ending date? Does the late Roman Empire end with the fall of the Western Roman Empire after 476 AD? Or does it end with the fall of Constantinople in 1453 AD? Well, you might be surprised to learn that neither nor. Both dates are quite far removed from when historians place the date for the ending time of the late Roman Empire. Taking 476 AD as the ending date would not make sense for many reasons. First of all, we have learned that actually not much spectacular happened in that year, and the famous fall was not really a fall, but more a change of government, and nothing really changed in Italy itself. Life went on as usual, and Italy continued to be formally part of the Roman Empire, with the seat of the emperor in Constantinople. Plus, the last Western Roman emperor died in 480 AD, and the last stronghold fell in 486 AD, so 476 AD as an ending date makes even less sense. And what about 1453 AD then? Well, that would make more sense, but then again historians like to call the period of the late Eastern Roman Empire Byzantine Empire. However, it is important to note that the so-called Byzantines never called themselves that. They always saw themselves as Romans. So in order to determine where the late Roman Empire ended, we would need to find where the Byzantine Empire began. And while I don't like the term Byzantine itself, it does make kind of sense in as far as that it denotes the cultural transformation that had taken place in that empire. Because the same way as a Roman from the early empire would not recognize a Roman from, say, around 400 AD in the West, the same way a Roman from 400 AD in the West would not recognize an Eastern Roman from, say, 1200 AD of the East. The culture would have transformed dramatically, and this cultural transformation is what Byzantine denotes. Most historians place the transition from Roman Empire to Byzantine Empire with the death of the Emperor Heraclius in 641 AD. So this would then also be the ending date of the late Roman Empire, since after 641 AD, we would speak about the Byzantine Empire. Does that make sense? I personally think it does. First of all, it was during that time that the Roman Empire really stopped being an empire in the sense of the word, namely a vast territory governed by a central authority in a Roman capital with many provinces in many different regions far removed from each other, but all united in a common Romanness. In the late 630s and early 640s, the Roman Empire lost Egypt and the Levant to the new rising Muslim Caliphate, as the Romans were weakened by decades of war against Persia in the east and the Slavs and Avars in the northwest. So the Roman Empire basically lost about half its territory. Also, it was during that time that Greek supplanted Latin as the official language at court. Even during the times of Justinian and Belisarius, Latin was still officially used as the court language. Yes, Greek was the main everyday language, but at court there was still a strong adherence to the old Roman traditions. Justinian and Belisarius themselves even were still native Latin speakers. During these days, many of the old Roman traditions were still completely intact, dating back to the times of Augustus himself. But during and after the reign of Heraclius, we would see profound changes. The court language would now become Greek. The emperor himself called himself Basileus, contrary to emperors before who had still used the title of Augustus even in the late 6th and early 7th century. Then we would also start to see a reorganization of the empire away from the previous Roman diocese system to the Byzantine themes, basically smaller units of administration. Also, it was during this time that we for the last time have a mention of an old Roman legion. The Legio Quinque Macedonica is mentioned for the last time in 636 AD, shortly before the Muslim conquest of Egypt and the Levant. So it was also during this time that the last traces of the old legions of Rome vanished. And of course, the cityscapes would transform dramatically after that period, from still imperial in appearance, as the empire was still able to erect many impressive buildings, to the more modest architecture of the coming early Middle Ages. The large fora, colonnaded streets and imperial columns were not built anymore, and many of the old cities began to fall into ruin and their stones used as building material in order to erect newer, more modest dwellings. Even Constantinople itself began to decay severely from after the Avar siege of 626 AD, when the aqueducts of the city were partially destroyed. Only 100 years later, Constantinople had possibly only as little as 50,000 inhabitants, only 10% of the peak population, and most of the city was abandoned and started to fall into ruin. Thus, this extreme transformation from a large empire to a more local, smaller one, in combination with the many cultural, administrative, military and urban changes, warrants to place the ending date for the late Roman Empire to around the mid-7th century, 650 AD plus minus. This is really when the empire ended and the medieval Byzantine Empire began. So the late Roman Empire would be the time from around 284 to 312 AD as a starting point, up to around the mid-7th century, so a time span of about 350 years. So the next time when I use the term late Roman Empire, you know exactly about which time period I'm talking. And please like and subscribe so that you won't miss any future videos on the fascinating era of the late Roman Empire. And please consider supporting my work on Patreon or via YouTube membership, because the long-term sustainability of this channel really depends on your support. This channel would not work without our amazing Patreon and YouTube members, and I want to thank each and everyone who is supporting this channel in any form. Gratias tibiago, amici. And if you want to learn more about how Constantinople changed in the early Middle Ages, you can watch this video in the upper right corner. But if you are more interested in learning how Rome itself changed during that time, you can watch the other video in the lower right corner. I say thanks again to all friends of Roman history, gratias tibiago, and bene valete.